I'd grown up in a political family where big ideas and big organizations, big power was in play. But for me, I was drawn immediately to the personal connection, to the work of justice, to the work of healing, to the work of fairness, to the work of overcoming some of the problems in our country, face to face, heart to heart, hand to hand. And for me, there was no institution or organization more powerful than a school. Schools have the most contact with children. They have the most connection to families. They have the most powerful long-term relationship with families and communities. So for me, it was seeing a few kids in a high school where I was observing in college, watching them, watching their anger, watching their adversarial behaviors, watching their affection, watching their desire, and I was like, oh my God, this is intense, beautiful, powerful, and a place where I can make a difference and where I can learn, I would say. I realized immediately that all the things I thought I knew about race and justice and politics, I had to relearn through the eyes of 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds, and I found that to be an extraordinary challenge and really a way to deepen my own sense of purpose with my own life, and I never wanted to leave, really. I think probably like a lot of people, I'd say my mother had the biggest impact on my life. My mother was extremely strong-willed, very, very passionate about what she believed in, very single-minded, very determined to have me and my brothers and sister join her. Strong believers that her kids had enormous capacity, but also a strong believer that she should raise the bar as absolutely high as was humanly possible. She motivated me not just to try to be successful in what I did, but to use my gifts in pursuit of justice and in pursuit of connection and in pursuit of healing. I dare say in pursuit of love. My mother had a deep faith that love was more powerful than anything else. And so I think it would be her inspiration that led me to strike out and try to do the best I could with the gifts I have to make a difference. In college, I was encouraged to do an observation, to test out a teacher prep class. And I went to, it was an urban high school, comprehensive high school. It had 4 schools within a school. It was largely African American, although increasingly it was growing in its Latino population. It was probably 60 or 70% free or reduced lunch high school. It was built in the sort of urban renewal era of the 1960s, so it had a lot of promise in the walls almost. The ideals were there, but it was struggling. It was struggling to reach the kids. It was struggling to reach families. The economic conditions at the time were horrific in New Haven, where I was in Connecticut in the Northeast. So it was a small town with small town access, but the problems were big. The anger and the frustration and the pain in many of the kids' lives was very obvious right away. So I was drawn to those kids. Even before I knew their names, I wanted to know what was going on in their lives and wanted to figure out whether I could make a difference. And it took me a long time, but I think over the years I finally learned a little bit about how to do that. A dignity revolution would invite us to recognize the dignity of every human being. It's a universal gift. No need to earn it, no capacity to lose it. The definition, the hope of any culture, of any community, would be that it recognizes the dignity of each of its citizens, each of its members, and gives each person a chance to share their gifts and be celebrated and valued for their gifts. It doesn't mean everybody's gift is the same, but when we create hierarchies, we create exclusion. And exclusion is a cancer in any community, and we have too much of it. I hope someday that we'll think about, in some ways, the original American ideal. The original American ideal, all human beings are created equal. They are all endowed by their Creator. They all seek life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They all want to pledge their sacred honor. Not some, not the intelligent, not the elite, not the educated, not the powerful, not the politicians, not the CEOs, everyone. Building communities like that, when you see them, even glimpses, I see that a lot in Special Olympics, I see it in special education programs, then all of a sudden you feel like you're crossing into a different dimension of reality. People sometimes say, this is where I want to live my life. This is the kind of community I want to live, I want to raise my children in. Sometimes it's fleeting, but when we catch it and we see it, I think we can hope to extend it and make it the norm, not the exception. My mother was involved in the founding of the Special Olympics movement, and in my own backyard, children were playing kickball and running races and swimming in the pool and so on when I was a very young child. So I grew up being exposed to people with intellectual differences, and not as a cause, and not as an issue, and not as a challenge, and not as an IEP or anything like that, as playmates. And I think that was really one of the great gifts my mother gave me, to introduce me to the challenges of inclusion through the joy of play, not through the burden of responsibility or the exhortation of duty. It was the joy of play. I just all of a sudden had a backyard that had like hundreds of people in it, and it was like, wow, this is fantastic. So many people to play with. I think if we use that lesson, it would make the world a little bit easier. I think in schools we need to remember that play and engagement, child to child, make it natural. Invite children, give them the opportunity, structured opportunities to play together. By playing together, one of the most formative ways in which children learn is through play. If we play together, we learn to live together. We learn to live together. We learn to grow and respect each other much more naturally. It's not a forced lesson. It's a natural experience. I think they need to know maybe three things. First of all, they need to be reminded of what probably motivated them to get an education. That all learning is social. All learning is emotional. There is no academic learning without relationship, and there is no relationship without emotional engagement. The brain depends on emotional engagement. Children depend on it. Finding meaning and purpose in information depend on it. All learning is social, emotional, and cognitive. So let's end the either or. That's number one. Number two, social and emotional learning can be taught and taught effectively. These are lessons around coping skills and self-regulation and relationship skills. They don't have to distract from the curriculum. They can be embedded into the curriculum. But when taught directly as skills, children come alive. They find ways to navigate the challenging and stressful situations they're in. Every school, in my view, should have a social and emotional learning scope and sequence, ways for teachers to be trained and ways to be supported in the classroom, and culture and climate activities. In the 21st century, that should be the norm. It will be someday. It's coming sooner than we think, I hope. The third thing they should know, when you do this work well, you get great benefits. Behavioral benefits, emotional benefits, reductions in behavior problems. Most importantly for teachers and for educators, improvements in test scores. So there's another either or that should be banished from our language. Either we make kids happy and content, or we make them smart and well-informed. Wrong. You make them happy and content and engaged and feel belonging so that they will be smart and well-informed and capable of working. There are no either-ors in this work. We lived in a century, the 20th century, where we split the child into the brain versus the heart. We split information into that which matters and that which seems to be irrelevant. We did all these splits. We split outcomes into academic outcomes versus nice-to-have outcomes. All wrong. They're wrong scientifically, they're wrong from practice, and they're wrong in terms of the evidence. So we have to unlearn some things that we were told seem to matter. But when most educators discover what social and emotional learning is and what it means, most of them, I mean the vast majority, over 90%, go, oh, thank God, that is what I've been thinking my whole life. Thank you for putting it in words, or thank you, Mr. or Miss whoever, for giving me a program to teach it. This is what I've always wanted. This is what I've always felt a teacher or an administrator should be. Well, I think the only thing that's valuable to society is honesty, honestly. The more we hide, the more we deceive, the more we confront others with deceptions. You know, the human soul is a vulnerable and tender and fragile creation. When we see loss, like we've seen recently in schools in Kentucky and now in Florida and Connecticut and across this country, we're reminded of it. Our hearts break. We cry, if we're honest. Sometimes we cry in despair over the loss of life. In those moments of fragility, we find our common humanity. We don't find something embarrassing. We actually find what links us together. And when we open ourselves with all of our fragility and vulnerability, I think we find the deepest connections that allow us to do the best work. So vulnerability isn't that which we should be ashamed of. It is actually the engine of all the good we can do in the world. Well, I think we're in a national soul-searching period on issues of equity. I think for many many of the last decades, there was a sense in which boundaries of race and income and that they were kind of overcomable with law, that we could change them with services, that we, if we were well-intentioned enough, could end these divisions with a little hard work. I think now we've come face to face, brilliant scholarship, persistent problems, the voices of pain and anger and frustration coming from people on the margins through no fault of their own. Those voices have informed us, have educated us that the inequities are far deeper than maybe we ever imagined, and that the persistent injustice is maybe far more deliberate than we might have ever been willing to admit. I think for educators, it's a tough set of issues because we're not just being asked to do our jobs better or to do our jobs differently, but to be different and to open ourselves up to the fact that we may be, in some ways, culpable perpetrators, unwitting accomplices in the persisting patterns of inequality that exist in our culture. It's hard for someone teaching English or math or science or language arts or other subjects, social studies, to see themselves as an agent of inequality. It's hard for them to see themselves as the repairers of the breach at the cultural and historic level. But we're arcing into that conversation. I think that the administrators in this community can be very powerful if given safe spaces to have these conversations, to own their own vulnerabilities around them, not to be blamed or antagonized, but to be invited into the conversation so that they can in fact become change agents in the culture. I mean, if you ask yourself, who's going to end it? Is it going to be political leaders? I'm sorry to say, I don't think so. Is it going to be business leaders? I mean, they can contribute, of course, but they have their own agenda. Is it going to be scholars? I think they will help inform us. But the people on the ground, the people in communities, the people living in families and in these communities are teachers and administrators. And if these institutional structures are going to shift, and if children who may have once been in experiences of marginalization and on the wrong end of racial and cultural bias and stigma and injustice, if they're going to see themselves in the mainstream, it's probably going to be maybe first through the eyes of a teacher. It's probably going to be in a school where all of a sudden maybe the paradigm shifts and these children will see themselves as valuable, see the respect and power they deserve being accorded to them and their families, and see a rebalancing of the culture in a way that's fair and just and good for kids. And so for those of us who are educators, I think we always can be easily motivated by what's good for kids. I think today, equity and ending the long history of explicit and implicit bias is good for kids. We ought to be leading it. I think there is some degree in which we have to attack stereotyping, attack labeling, attack the marginalization of groups, the separation we see in this country now around issues around politics. I won't speak to them, or they're just too far gone. I won't even have him or her in my house. It has a resonance. We don't think it has a resonance to these other things, but there's the same thing going on. You're too different to be included in my world. You don't belong, you're evil. I had a question just the other day, so raise their hand. Well, you say we should all get along, but what about all these people in the country? 30, 40% of the country, these are evil people. You could have been talking almost any other time in very, very dangerous and precarious situations. So I think there is a common ground. I think people with intellectual disabilities for thousands and thousands of years heard that. And make no mistake, they heard it. They heard it. You're too different. You don't have any value. You're not important. You're a retard. You're a bozo. You're an imbecile. You're an idiot. You're defective. They heard it. And they were sent away. Almost unheard and unknown to history. Thousands, millions of lives lost. So we can learn from that. And I think we can maybe soften our hearts and harden our resolve to try to end that kind of labeling and stigmatization that human beings, I don't know why, but we're just given to it. And it is an extremely dangerous and very, very potentially violent pattern when allowed to go unchecked. And I think we need to check that pattern now in this country today. I think what I know is that every person is beautiful and unique, and that the gift of recognizing that is also the gift of recognizing it in others. And what I always felt as a teacher was that if I could excite people, inspire people to think that they themselves had a beautiful, magical, and unique gift, and that they could see that in their peers, that everything else would take care of itself. The dates of the Civil War could be memorized like that. But if they didn't know that they were gifted, and if they didn't see that gift in their peers, their sense of purpose and belonging would stand in the way. The absence of purpose and belonging would stand in the way of everything. So I think the painful and subtle and persistent belief that some people don't have gifts is out there, and I've been given the chance to see that it's wrong. Everybody has a gift, and recognizing it means you see it in others too, and then you have the chance for not only a great future but a great life.